The gavel came down hard, and the laughter that followed filled every corner of the courtroom. Adrian Cole had just agreed to walk away from nearly everything: the properties, the investments, the accounts, handing it all to Vanessa and her team of high-priced attorneys without a single counteroffer. Gregory Hale leaned back in his chair, barely concealing his smirk. Everyone in that room had already written Adrian off as a broken man, but not one of them noticed the quiet steadiness in his eyes, or the faint trace of a smile on his face as he walked out the door. The courtroom had the particular smell of old wood and recycled air that made everything feel more final than it needed to. Adrian Cole sat at the left table, his jacket slightly wrinkled, his posture relaxed in a way that read as either defeat or indifference, depending on who was watching. Most people in that room had already decided which one it was. Across the aisle, Vanessa Cole looked exactly the way she always looked in high-stakes rooms: composed, deliberate, dressed in a charcoal blazer that cost more than most people's monthly rent. She didn't look at Adrian. She hadn't looked at him once since the session began, which was a message in itself. When you've already won, you don't need to watch the other person lose. Gregory Hale sat beside her with the relaxed confidence of a man who had never lost a case he cared about. He had silver hair, a custom suit, and the particular habit of clicking his pen twice before making a point. A small theatrical gesture that had probably intimidated hundreds of opposing counsel over the years. He glanced at Adrian's side of the room, the way a chess player glances at a board they've already solved. Daniel Marsh, Adrian's attorney, was a decent lawyer in the middle range of the profession. Not flashy, not well-connected, but careful. He had spent the last 3 weeks preparing arguments he genuinely believed in. He had a folder open in front of him, the corners of several pages flagged with adhesive tabs, and he kept his voice low as he leaned toward his client. "Adrian, you don't have to do this," Daniel said quietly, his eyes scanning the room for a moment before returning to Adrian's face. "We have ground to stand on. The Meridian account alone gives us leverage. Walk away now, and you're handing her everything she asked for without a single concession." Adrian didn't move. He sat with his hands loosely folded on the table, looking straight ahead at the judge's bench, and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Let them have the Meridian account." Daniel stared at him. "That's a $2.4 million asset." "I know what it is," Adrian said. His voice was even, unhurried. He wasn't agitated, wasn't performing calm for anyone in the room. He simply appeared to be a man who had already thought through every consequence and found them acceptable. Judge Patricia Warren had been presiding over family court for 19 years, and she had seen every variation of the divorce proceeding: the screaming spouses, the bitter custody fights, the financial games that people played when a marriage finally came apart at the seams. She had developed the practiced neutrality of someone who no longer expected human behavior to surprise her. She looked at Adrian over the rim of her reading glasses, with the expression of a woman verifying what she was seeing was real. "Mr. Cole," she said, "I want to confirm for the record that you are voluntarily agreeing to the terms as outlined in Exhibit 14, which includes surrendering your claim to the joint property on Harlan Drive, the Meridian Capital account, and the majority of shared investments. Is that your understanding?" "It is," Adrian said. "And you've reviewed these terms with your attorney?" "I have." "And you are accepting this agreement of your own free will, without coercion or duress?" "Yes, Your Honor." The murmur that moved through the gallery was low, but unmistakable. A few reporters who covered the financial pages were in attendance. Vanessa Cole's name carried weight in certain business circles, and divorces with assets this size had a way of drawing quiet attention. One of them was already typing something on his phone beneath the railing. Gregory Hale leaned slightly toward Vanessa and said something close to her ear. She gave the smallest nod, and the trace of satisfaction on her face was visible to anyone watching closely enough. She had expected a fight. She had prepared for months for a fight. The fact that there wasn't one only confirmed what she had always believed, that Adrian had nothing real to offer and never had. But then Daniel Marsh cleared his throat and said, "Your Honor, my client does have one condition he'd like added to the agreement." Hale's pen stopped clicking. Judge Warren looked up. "Go ahead." Daniel read from a single sheet of paper, his tone measured and careful. Both parties agree to irrevocably waive all future claims to any assets, accounts, properties, or financial instruments not currently disclosed or listed in the present settlement documentation, with no right of amendment or revisitation. The room was quiet for a moment. It was the kind of clause that sounded technical and harmless, a standard clean break provision, or close enough to one that a distracted ear might not catch the difference. Hale studied the language. He turned it over in his mind with the practiced speed of someone who had reviewed thousands of contracts. He looked at Vanessa. She gave a small shrug, a gesture that meant, essentially, there's nothing undisclosed on our end that matters. The assets she hadn't reported were small in comparison to what she was gaining today. Her team had structured things carefully. She wasn't worried. "We accept the addition," Hale said. Judge Warren nodded. "The clause will be incorporated into the final settlement. Both parties will sign before leaving today." She looked at Adrian one more time, the way someone looks at a man standing in the rain who has refused an umbrella. "Mr. Cole, is there anything further you'd like to add before I finalize the terms?" "No, Your Honor," Adrian said. "I think we're done here." The gavel came down, and that was the moment the laughter started. Not open laughter, not cruel and loud, but the kind that moves through a room in looks and half smiles and quietly spoken words. A few people in the gallery shook their heads. One of the junior associates at Hale's table said something to the paralegal beside her, and they both smiled into their paperwork. Daniel Marsh gathered his documents with the stiff precision of a man trying not to show how he felt. He had done his job. His client had chosen not to use it. Vanessa signed the documents with a steady hand, her expression unchanged. She had expected this to take longer. She had expected resistance, maybe even a scene. Instead, she was finishing early, and the outcome was everything she had wanted. The house, the accounts, the majority of their shared holdings, the business assets that she had, in her own telling, built herself while Adrian played a background role in their marriage. She told this story so often that she had long since stopped questioning it. Adrian signed on his designated lines without reading them again. He already knew every word. He handed the pen back to the court clerk, straightened the front of his jacket, and picked up the thin folder that sat beside him, the only thing he was taking with him when he walked out of the room. Gregory Hale watched him go with the mild curiosity of someone watching a chess piece being removed from the board. Adrian Cole said nothing. He walked to the door at a pace that was neither fast nor slow, pushed it open, and was gone before most people in the room had looked up from their phones. Daniel Marsh followed his client into the hallway and found him standing near the window at the end of the corridor, looking out at the gray morning sky over the street below. He looked like a man waiting for a cab, not a man who had just signed away several $1 million in assets. "I hope you know what you're doing," Daniel said. There was no anger in it, just the honest concern of a professional who had done everything he could. Adrian looked at him. "I do." "That clause," Daniel said carefully. "The undisclosed assets provision. That goes both ways, Adrian. If there's anything on her side that wasn't reported—" "I know," Adrian said. Daniel studied him for a moment. Then he nodded once, closed his briefcase, and walked toward the elevator without another word. He was a careful man. He didn't ask questions when the answers were already in the room, just outside the edge of what he was allowed to know. Adrian turned back to the window. Down on the street, a town car was pulling up to the curb outside the courthouse entrance. He watched Vanessa emerge through the glass doors below, steady, unhurried, already on her phone. Gregory Hale walked beside her, still talking, gesturing with one hand, in the particular way of a man who likes the sound of his own authority. Neither of them looked up. Adrian watched them get into the car, watched it pull back into traffic, and disappear around the corner. Then he picked up his phone, scrolled to a number he had called many times before, and typed a single message. "It's done. Move forward." He put the phone back in his pocket and walked toward the elevator. The hallway was empty. No one was watching him anymore, which was exactly how he preferred it. The message Adrian sent from the courthouse hallway went to a man named Carter Wells, who operated out of a glass-walled office on the 32nd floor of a building in the financial district that most people passed without a second thought. Carter was 43, methodical, and had worked with Adrian for 11 years, long enough to understand that when Adrian said, "Move forward," he meant exactly that, and that no further instruction was required. Carter forwarded the message to 3 other people, each in a different city, each managing a different piece of a structure that had been quietly assembled over the course of 18 months. None of them knew the full picture. That was by design. The story of how Adrian Cole came to hold significant stakes in several technology companies without anyone knowing his name was not a dramatic one. It was built on patience, on the deliberate choice to stay invisible at every stage of every deal, and on the understanding that the most powerful position in any room is the one that no one else thinks to look for. He had started placing capital into early-stage technology ventures in his late 20s, always through intermediary funds, always at a remove from anything that would put his name in a press release. The returns were substantial. The anonymity was more valuable. By the time he married Vanessa, he had accumulated a portfolio that he kept entirely separate from their shared life, not out of secrecy for its own sake, but because he had seen enough of how money changed the dynamics between people to know that he didn't want it in the middle of his marriage. What he hadn't anticipated was how completely Vanessa would come to define their life together in financial terms, or how thoroughly she would come to believe that her version of their story was the only true one. In Vanessa's version, she had built everything. She had grown her consulting firm from a 3-person operation into a company managing financial strategy for mid-size corporations across 7 states. She had cultivated the clients, closed the deals, put in the hours. Adrian had been present but peripheral, quiet, supportive in the background, occasionally useful for a conversation, but never the driving force behind anything significant. She believed this so completely that it had become, for her, simply a description of reality. What she didn't know was that 2 of her largest clients had come through introductions that traced back, through several degrees of separation, to Adrian's network. She didn't know because he had never told her, and because the people involved had no reason to connect those dots for her. She had assumed the business came to her on the strength of her own reputation. That assumption served Adrian's purposes well enough that he had never corrected it. He had spent most of their marriage watching and learning the shape of what Vanessa was building, the clients she prioritized, the financial structure she favored, the places where her ambition outpaced her caution. Vanessa moved fast and trusted her own judgment completely, which meant that when she made a mistake in structuring a deal, she rarely caught it herself, and the people around her rarely told her. 3 weeks before the divorce hearing, Adrian had sat across from Carter in that 32nd floor office and laid out the full picture for the first time. Carter had listened without interrupting, which was his habit, and when Adrian finished, Carter had asked only one question. "The clause. You think she'll accept it?" "She thinks there's nothing undisclosed on her side that I can use," Adrian said. "She's wrong about that, but she doesn't know she's wrong, which means she'll sign it without hesitation because she'll think it protects her just as much as it protects me." Carter thought about this for a moment. "And if Hale catches it?" "Hale will look at the language and decide it's standard. He's handled 100 clean break clauses. This one reads the same as the others on the surface. He'll tell her it's fine." Adrian set down his coffee. The clause only binds undisclosed assets. Everything I hold runs through registered intermediary funds. All of it is on record somewhere, just not in my name. Technically, there's nothing for me to disclose under the settlement's own definition of marital assets. That's the structure. It's clean. That assessment had proven correct. Hale had read the clause, considered it for 30 seconds, and accepted it. The language was careful, precise enough to be binding, familiar enough to pass without alarm. What Vanessa had not disclosed in the settlement documentation was a network of 3 investment vehicles she had set up through a subsidiary of her consulting firm over the previous 4 years. She had structured them to look like operating accounts, routine business infrastructure, but they functioned as holding entities for significant capital she had accumulated through a series of deals that sat in a legal gray area. Her attorney knew about 2 of them. The third, she had kept entirely to herself. The combined value of those 3 vehicles was somewhere between $8 and $12 million, depending on how you assessed the current position of the assets inside them. Adrian knew about all 3. He had known about them for 14 months, had documented their structure quietly, and had said nothing. He had waited. The clause he added to the settlement agreement meant that Vanessa had now formally waived any right to claim those assets, or contest their ownership, in any future proceeding. She had signed away the legal ground she would have needed to stand on. And because she hadn't disclosed them, she couldn't now argue she had been uninformed about what she was signing away, without simultaneously admitting to the non-disclosure. It was a clean trap. The door opened only from the inside, and she had walked through it herself. The other part of the structure was moving now, in the weeks following the courthouse, while Vanessa prepared for what she considered the defining moment of her professional career. The deal she was building centered on a technology company called Arlon Systems, a mid-sized data infrastructure firm that had been struggling with capital structure for 2 years and was looking for a strategic partner to stabilize its balance sheet and position it for acquisition. Vanessa had been working the Arlon relationship for 8 months. She had presented herself to their board as the lead financial strategist on the restructuring, and she had lined up what she believed was the primary funding commitment from an investment group called Westfield Capital Partners. She had pitched this deal at 3 separate industry events, talked about it in interviews, and told her senior staff that closing Arlon would be the moment that moved her firm from regional relevance to national standing. She believed in it completely. What she didn't know was that Westfield Capital Partners was a fund in which Adrian held a controlling interest through a series of intermediary positions he had assembled over the previous decade. The fund's managing director, a composed and precise man named Thomas Reeve, had been in regular contact with Adrian since before the divorce proceedings began. Thomas understood his role clearly, and he played it without variation, present in every meeting Vanessa requested, professional in every communication, giving her every reason to believe the commitment was solid and the partnership was hers. Carter had asked Adrian once, early in the process, whether this was about money or something else. It was a reasonable question. The financial outcome for Adrian was significant, but it wasn't the kind of number that should require this level of complexity from a man who already had substantial resources. Adrian had thought about the question carefully before answering. "It's about accuracy," he said finally. "She built a story about who I was and what I was worth. She told it to enough people that it became the version everyone accepted. I'm not interested in arguing with the story. I'm interested in replacing it with the facts." Carter had nodded and hadn't asked again. Vanessa spent the 2 weeks after the settlement in a state of controlled momentum that she recognized as her best operating mode. The divorce was behind her. The settlement had gone exactly as she planned. She had the assets, the freedom, and the runway she needed to take the Arlon deal across the finish line. She did not think about Adrian. He had taken his small payout and disappeared, which was precisely what she had expected him to do. The only thing that occasionally surfaced in her mind was the clause, and when it did, she dismissed it the same way she had in the courtroom. The vehicles she had structured were minor details in the larger picture. Nothing that mattered. Gregory Hale had called her once after the settlement and mentioned, almost in passing, that the clause Adrian had added was slightly unusual in its construction. She had told him not to overthink it. He had agreed and moved on. The event was held on a Thursday evening at a venue in the financial district, a former exchange building that had been converted into a reception space, all high ceilings and exposed steel. The kind of room that made ordinary announcements feel significant. Vanessa had chosen it deliberately. The guest list was curated. Board members, investors, a handful of financial press, and senior representatives from Westfield Capital Partners, including Thomas Reeve. She stood near the front of the room as the event opened, working the space with the practiced ease of someone who understood that these moments were as much performance as business. Arlen's board chairman was present. The term sheets were finalized. All that remained was the formal announcement and the handshake in front of the cameras that would put her name on the front page of the financial press tomorrow morning. Thomas Reeve found her near the center of the room about 40 minutes into the event. He shook her hand, said that the evening looked like a success, and told her that he had someone he wanted to introduce before the formal remarks began. His tone was professional and even, exactly as it always was. She followed him toward the far end of the room, where a small group stood near the tall windows overlooking the street below. The lights of the city were clear and cold through the glass, and it took her a moment to register the figure standing at the edge of the group, his back partially turned, speaking quietly with one of the Arlon board members. When he turned, she recognized him immediately. Adrian Cole was not wearing a wrinkled jacket. He was dressed precisely, his posture straight, his expression composed in the way that she now understood. In a single disorienting flash, she had never actually read correctly. He looked like a man who belonged in every room she had ever tried to keep him out of. He looked like he had been here the whole time. Thomas Reeve said simply, "Vanessa, I believe you know Mr. Cole. He's the principal investor behind Westfield Capital Partners and the lead stakeholder in the Arlon restructuring." Vanessa did not move. The noise of the room continued around her. Glasses, voices, the low sound of a presentation beginning somewhere behind her. But she was standing in a space where none of it reached her. She was processing something that her mind kept trying to reject. That the deal she had spent 8 months building, the deal she had announced to her team and her industry as the proof of everything she was, had been structured and funded by the man she had dismissed as having nothing. Adrian looked at her with the same steady calm he had carried in the courtroom. He didn't smile. He didn't say anything designed to land hard. He simply extended his hand and said in the same measured voice she had heard 100 times across a dinner table, "It's good to see you, Vanessa." The Arlon board chairman, standing nearby and entirely unaware of the history in the room, turned to her with an expectant expression and said that he was looking forward to the formal remarks. Vanessa took Adrian's hand. Her grip was controlled. Her face gave nothing away to anyone watching from a distance, but her mind was already moving at a different speed, racing back through the settlement documentation, through the clause, through the vehicles she had structured and not disclosed, through the morning in the courtroom when she had signed her name without reading carefully enough. She had thought she was watching a man give up everything. She understood now, with a precision that felt like cold water, that she had been watching something else entirely. The formal remarks began on schedule. A moderator stepped to the front of the room, thanked the guests for attending, and introduced the Arlon Systems restructuring as a milestone transaction for the regional technology sector. Vanessa stood near the left edge of the assembled group, her expression composed, her hand still, listening to words she had imagined hearing for 8 months. But the architecture of this moment had changed. She was watching the same event she had planned, but she was watching it from the wrong side of it. Thomas Reeve was introduced as the representative of Westfield Capital Partners. He spoke briefly and precisely about the fund's commitment to the transaction, and that commitment made clear to anyone paying close attention that Westfield's role in this deal was not advisory, but foundational. The capital structure of the entire Arlon restructuring ran through Westfield. Without that commitment, there was no deal. Vanessa had known this, of course. She had spent months cultivating exactly that dependency. She had simply never considered the possibility that the person holding the other end of that rope was Adrian. Adrian stood near the back of the room during the remarks, slightly apart from the main group. He didn't seek attention or position himself for visibility. He occupied the room the way he had always occupied important rooms, present, observant, and entirely unreadable to anyone who hadn't known where to look. When the formal portion of the evening concluded, the room shifted into the looser rhythm of post-event conversation. Vanessa found herself standing near one of the tall windows, looking out at the city below, when Gregory Hale appeared at her side. He had arrived late, which was unusual for him, and he had clearly been briefed by someone in the room about what had been announced. His expression carried the particular controlled tension of a man who prided himself on knowing things before other people did, and had just discovered a significant gap in his information. "Tell me this isn't what it looks like," Hale said. Vanessa looked at him. "It's exactly what it looks like." Hale was quiet for a moment. She could see him working back through the settlement, through the clause, through the documentation, arriving at the same place she had arrived at 40 minutes ago when Thomas Reeve had said Adrian's name. "The undisclosed assets provision," he said finally. His voice was low and careful. "Yes," Vanessa said. "I read that clause," Hale said. "I advised you to accept it." "You did?" He didn't apologize. That wasn't how Gregory Hale operated. He was already thinking about whether there was a legal avenue, a procedural challenge, something that could be used to reopen what had been closed. "If his interest in Westfield predates the settlement," Hale said, "and we can establish that the Arlon position was known to him at the time of signing, there may be an argument that the clause was constructed to—" Vanessa cut him off. "He didn't hide it in the documentation, Gregory. He structured it so that nothing in the settlement required him to disclose it. His holdings run through registered intermediary funds, outside the definition of marital assets the settlement used. There was nothing on his side that was technically undisclosed. He managed that deliberately." She turned away from the window. "The clause was designed to bind me, not him. He knew exactly what was and wasn't on his list when he signed." Hale absorbed this. His jaw tightened slightly, the expression of a man encountering an opponent who had played a cleaner game than he had, and finding the experience professionally uncomfortable. He said nothing further on the legal question, because there was nothing further to say. She was right, and he understood that she was right, and they both understood what that meant for where they stood. "What do you want to do?" he asked. Vanessa looked across the room to where Adrian was speaking quietly with one of the Arlon board members. He was not performing. He was not making eye contact with her across the room for effect. He was simply talking to someone, in the way of a person who had come to an event with a purpose and was completing it. There was no theater in him. That, she was realizing, had always been true, and she had always read it as absence, as evidence of someone who wasn't fully present. She understood now that she had been reading the wrong sign. "Nothing tonight," she said. "There's nothing to do tonight." 3 weeks later, Gregory Hale sent her a formal letter withdrawing from the representation. The letter cited scheduling constraints. She read it once, set it aside, and did not call him. It was, in its own way, the clearest signal yet of how completely the ground had shifted. The full scope of what Vanessa faced clarified in the 72 hours following the event, as her legal team went through the settlement documentation with the kind of attention they should have applied before the signatures were dry. The 3 investment vehicles she had structured outside the disclosed assets were now formally unreachable. The clause she had signed gave her no legal foothold to claim them, contest their current ownership position, or argue that she had been uninformed. She had been represented by counsel. She had reviewed the documents. She had accepted the terms. The Arlon deal proceeded, but it proceeded under Westfield's terms, which were Adrian's terms, and Vanessa's firm retained its advisory role in the transaction, but did not hold the structural position she had been building toward. She was a participant, not an architect. She had spent 8 months building toward a specific outcome, and had arrived at a different one entirely, in a room full of the people she had most wanted to impress. News moved through the financial community in the way it always does, through conversations at the edges of other conversations, through careful language and emails designed to say something without quite saying it. There was no official story to report because nothing had been made public. What happened instead was that the version of Vanessa Cole her professional circle had believed in, the self-made strategist who had built everything herself, began to shift quietly in the minds of the people who knew the details, which was enough people to matter. She didn't lose clients immediately. She didn't lose her firm. But she felt the change the way you feel a change in air pressure. Not as a single event, but as a condition that had altered and wouldn't be returning to what it was. Adrian completed the operational transfer of the Arlon restructuring in the weeks that followed, working through Carter and Thomas with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized the entire process. He did not speak publicly about the settlement or about Vanessa. He did not give interviews. He simply did what he had been doing for years, moved capital, completed structures, and let the outcomes speak without any narrative attached to them. Carter asked him once, after the Arlon transfer was finalized, whether the outcome had been what he intended. Adrian thought about it for a moment. "I wanted the record to be accurate," he said. "Not my version of it, just accurate. She built something real. She's good at what she does. But the story she told about our marriage, about what I was and wasn't, that story wasn't accurate. I didn't want to argue about it. I wanted there to be a different set of facts available to anyone who looked." Carter nodded. "And now there is." "And now there is," Adrian said. There was one evening, about a month after the Arlon event, when Adrian drove past the courthouse where the settlement had been signed. He was passing it on the way somewhere else, and it appeared through the car window, the way buildings do when you know their significance, standing in the same place, in the same gray stone, entirely unchanged by what had happened inside it. He thought about the room, about the laughter that had moved through it, about Daniel Marsh packing his flagged documents into a briefcase with the expression of a man who understood something had happened, but didn't yet know what. He wondered briefly if Daniel had figured it out since then, and decided that he probably had. He didn't think about Vanessa the way someone thinks about an enemy. He thought about her the way you think about a situation that taught you something, with detachment and without particular feeling. She had made choices across years, and the consequences of those choices had arrived in the order that consequences usually arrive: late, compounded, and all at once. That wasn't something he had manufactured. It was something he had simply declined to prevent. The people who had been in that courtroom, the associates at Hale's table, the reporters along the gallery rail, the clerk who had watched Adrian hand back the pen, most of them heard pieces of what had happened through the circuits that financial news travels. Some of them remembered the morning of the settlement. Some of them thought back to the moment when everyone in the room had come to the same easy conclusion about a quietly dressed man who didn't argue, didn't perform, and walked out without looking back. None of them had questioned what they were seeing at the time. The image had been clear: a man losing, a woman winning. The natural end of a story about who had power and who didn't. They had simply been looking at the wrong details, the same way people usually are when they stop paying attention before the thing is actually over. Adrian Cole returned to the work that had always occupied him, invisible, precise, indifferent to the version of himself that existed in other people's minds. He had never needed that version to be accurate while the game was in progress. He only needed it to be accurate when it was done. It was accurate now. That was enough.